to school for this stuff. And this is Elena.
My name is Elena. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for coming. I just graduated my master's program for counseling. I do not have kids. I work with a lot of young adults, and I have some experience in that and some education in early development. So hopefully we can all learn from each other. I can learn from you guys. And yeah, if anybody has questions at any time, just raise your hand, stop us, like Jen said.
Yeah. So here's our agenda for the night. We're going to spend the first half talking about emotional regulation. We'll do some, kind of lecture style content delivery. We're also going to have a chance to kind of pair up and have more dialogue. And then we'll take a break. And then we'll jump into the building resiliency part, which similarly we're going to do some content. We'll also do an activity. So hopefully it's not just us talking at you the whole time, because I know that that's not fun for kids. It's also not fun for adults. So, understanding emotional regulation. Emotional regulation, there's lots of definitions that we can pull from, and none of them are wrong. It's more kind of how are you applying it. So, the ability to manage, respond, and recognize emotions in a healthy and appropriate way. It helps us maintain balance and ensure that our emotions don't overwhelm us or disrupt our day-to-day functioning. Like the key is how do we make it so that our emotions that we're going to experience, because we're humans and that's what humans do, how do we make sure that our emotions don't get in the way of us living out our lives, right? Achieving our goals, maintaining our relationships, being able to function at work or school. Effective emotional regulation will support a child's social, emotional, cognitive development, foster resiliency, which we're going to talk about in the second half, as well as have positive relationships. And so for parents, we have to develop the skills, right, of understanding how to kind of be attuned to our children, recognize their feelings as they're working on developing their own emotional regulation. We're kind of like doing the heavy lifting for them until they reach that point of maturity where they can really take over and manage their own emotions. It also means, and we're going to talk a lot about this, is kind of keeping our own emotional regulation in check, especially when our children are dysregulated and having a hard time. And that also includes our own self-care, which is always much easier said than done when we're talking about being a parent, to kind of fit self-care in. So we're going to do a little bit of science, not too sciencey, but kind of just like having an understanding of like what's actually going on when your kid is having a meltdown, whether it's a little kid meltdown or it's a big kid meltdown. What is actually going on? And so if we think about it from like a neuroscience perspective, we have our two brains, our left brain and our right brain. Our left brain is more of our logical brain. Our right brain is more of our emotional brain. And if you're looking at it from in my work, we do a lot of dialectical behavioral therapy, and we use a similar model, but we'll call it our emotional mind and our logical mind. So it's the same, we're speaking the same language, just kind of using different words for it. So we also have following the model from the Whole Brain Child. I don't know if anyone's read that book by Dan Siegel and Tina Payne. Really love that book. I think they do a really good job of breaking it down in a way that non-neuroscientists can understand what's actually going on with our children at a little bit of a deeper level. We have our downstairs brain. That's our fight, flight, baby cries when hungry brain, right? Like we're born with those things, and those are really kind of like lizard brain, right? Like the limbic system, just like your automatic kind of reactions. And then we have our upstairs brain, which is more sophisticated. That has to do with developing empathy and morality and impulse control. And the upstairs brain is what is developing throughout the course of childhood into young adulthood. So the goal is to kind of have an integration of the two. The left brain, if you're all the way over here, right, you're just operating in left brain, you're not really going to be tuned into emotions. And if you're all the way on the other side, you're going to have an emotional takeover. The goal is to kind of create an integration. Because when we have an integration, again, in therapy, we'll call it we're in wise mind, right? We've integrated the two different sides, and we're able to apply the logic from our logic brain and the emotions from our emotional brain to be able to really kind of make a really accurate assessment of what the situation calls for and how we can really help ourselves kind of cope through the situation. So the goal is always like an integration of the two brains. It's not that one brain is better than the other. It's really that when we're in either one, kind of too far on the spectrum, we're probably not going to be feeling very great. And so sometimes when kids are having a hard time and they're in left brain, they shut down. We see that a lot in older kids, but we also see it with kids who might have some neurodiversity, ADHD, right? They just get overwhelmed and they shut down. We also have it all the way on the other side where we see kids who are screaming, right? Throwing things, crying, yelling. And so either side, can have its own struggles. There's no like optimal right or left. They're both really important, serve a really critical purpose. And also it's best when we kind of have that integration. And so regulation, emotional regulation is really about how do we get kids to have that integration. So a little bit more science. So unlike the primitive downstairs brain, which is intact at birth, the more sophisticated upstairs brain is under construction during childhood and adolescence. So this means children are more likely to get hijacked by their downstairs brain, especially in high stress, high emotion situations. So again, those expectations, right? I was gonna include a video, but I decided not to, but it was one that was like, just really naming and calling out like how difficult it is to be like cycle breakers, right? So a lot of us may have been raised with parents that were not particularly attuned to emotional needs, right? Of their own or of ours. And so we're parenting with the experience of how we were parented, which is very different, but we're trying to do something different. And that's really hard to do, right? Because we're breaking cycles, but we're doing it without necessarily having it been modeled to us as well. And so I just want to, take a minute to really just like say that and hold space for that because it's really hard. I feel like it every day. It's really hard to do. We're doing really hard things and it's worth it, but it's still hard and we can call it out and say that I'm doing a really hard thing. I'm not going to be perfect at it, like not even close, right? And we're going to talk more too about like the importance of repair, right? Like we can expect that we're going to have meltdowns, our kids are going to have meltdowns, and focusing more on what does repair look like, right? How do we reconnect with our kids? How do we reconnect with our spouses, right? To kind of weather those storms because we're all human and we're going to continue to have these emotions all the time. Like I tell a lot of my clients, like one emotion sticks around too long. Like out of the course of a day, we're going to cycle through dozens, if not more emotions. And so we really can learn how to practice riding the wave, right? Of like, I'm in a moment, but it is just a moment, right? I'm not going to feel this upset for the next 12 hours. Probably I'll feel this upset for the next 40 minutes, maybe, right? Like our emotions really do transition fairly quickly. And so, the expectations about making, children always making the right decisions, or I think about at school sometimes that they're always sitting still, and they're always listening, and they're always, right? Those are some really big expectations for some really underdeveloped brains. And I know that it's helpful for me, both as a professional when I worked in schools, but also as a parent, that I say out loud and to my colleagues, like, they have underdeveloped brains, guys. We're dealing with people with underdeveloped brains. We're not dealing with adults with fully developed brains. They're underdeveloped. So if you're wondering why they're making poor choices, we know the why. They have underdeveloped brains. And that has really helped me just like keep myself centered when I'm starting to feel like, why is this kid doing this, right? Why are they giving me such a hard time? Remembering like, oh, it's because they have an underdeveloped brain. It helps to kind of switch gears into it being an emotional experience to switching more to being like, let's apply what I know to the situation to help de-escalate some of these big feelings. So when your child has flipped their lid, right, the upstairs part of the brain is not available. They're not making good choices. And they're not able to make good decisions or show empathy or have self-control. And so I don't know if you guys have already picked up on this, but that's not the time to try to teach them something new. They're probably gonna just look at you and continue doing whatever it is that they're doing, and nothing is gonna sink in, right? A dysregulated child is not a child who can receive new learning. We have to wait until they've gotten back to a place, right, of emotional regulation, and then we go in and say, let's talk about what happened, right? What could we have done differently? what were you feeling at that time? You know, what are some other options we have to handle the situation in the future? And so I often still have to remind myself of that. Like, you're lecturing right now and this kid is crying. Like, just stop. You're wasting your time. You're only going to get more frustrated, and your kid is only going to get more frustrated. So here are a few signs of emotional dysregulation. Overly intense emotions, right? Like a big reaction to a not so big thing. Impulsive behavior, a lack of awareness, indecisiveness, right? Like they can't decide. My kid does this all the time. I'm like, what do you want for breakfast? I don't know. He gets so mad. I'm like, that was a really simple question. What's going on? You know what we have. It's the same thing every day. Here are some others. So mood swings, right? They may be really fine one day, 1 minute, and then really upset the next, and then they're back to being fine. You know, the tantrums and the meltdowns. But it also may look like more serious things like self-injurious behavior, right? And that can include like head banging. It can include kind of scratching themselves either with their own fingernails or with kids. They find everything, like the tab of a soda can, right? Like lots of things. You know, and those can be really scary, right? I work with a lot of kids who have self-injurious behaviors, and parents are always like, what do I do? This is so overwhelming. And I try really hard to kind of differentiate between like self-injurious behavior is not the same as suicidal ideation and suicidal attempts. That's really important to understand because the way we approach those two different situations is very different, right? Understanding that self-injurious behavior is something people do when they don't have the skills to communicate and cope with their feelings. And so they're doing something physical to create a stimulus, right? So that way they're distracted from the feelings that they're having a hard time processing. And that's a very different thing than wanting to take your life, right? And so it's very scary territory. Most people don't want to go there, even talk about it. But I did want to mention it because it can happen, and it doesn't necessarily mean that your child is in that like high risk of like they need to be hospitalized. It's probably more likely that it's a skills gap issue. They don't have the skills to cope through a difficult emotion, and so this is what they've come up with. Similarly, right, aligned, right, is like hair pulling, right? Things like that. It's all in the same category. So if they're pulling their hair or they're picking, skin picking, some kids will pick scabs. Same thing with disordered eating, right? Restrictive eating. It's all in that same category of something emotional is going on. I don't have the tools to deal with it, so I'm going to turn to the physical. What can I do physically? I can physically restrict my eating. I can physically pull my hair out or pick my skin or scratch myself with a whatever. And so those can be signs that they need assistance, right? A child needs some more kind of support in developing those specific coping skills, and also help in identifying the triggers, right? What are you actually feeling and what are the triggers? And perfectionism is another one, right? That's another kind of way we can control when our emotions are feeling out of control, is to be really fixated on perfectionism. Does anyone have a perfectionist kid? Yeah. Does anyone have a kid that will rip up something that the words aren't written just right? Yeah. Right? Or they get really upset if they get a B, right? Or they change their clothes many, many times because it doesn't feel right, look right? And they want it to look just right. Those are all ways that we cope with our emotions, with something that's bothering us, without really addressing the issue, right? We call it maladaptive coping mechanism. So we all do lots of maladapting coping mechanisms. Anyone here emotionally eat? Like after a hard day, right? That's a maladaptive coping mechanism. It doesn't mean that like it's the worst thing we could ever do, but it's a maladaptive coping mechanism. Drinking is a maladaptive coping mechanism, but lots of people do it because it also like kind of does the job in the moment, right? It does just good enough of a job to kind of distract and help us cope with a hard thing we're trying to deal with, that we keep doing it, even though in the long run it actually is quite damaging to our lives, right? Just like in the long run, pulling out your hair is not something you want. You don't want a bald spot. But a lot of times, those are the things we go to when there's an absence of more adaptive coping mechanisms. And then anxiety. I know that someone wanted, who registered when we asked about different topics, you wanted to discuss, that was on there. So I wanted to make sure that we spent some time talking about anxiety, because anxiety is a funny little thing, isn't it? it presents itself such an array of symptoms. Oftentimes, not even we can't even always tell if that is exactly anxiety. Does anyone have an anxious kid? Yeah, that's a really common one. The anxious kid seems to be like the most common presentation of mental health issues with kids. We actually have a whole other parent seminar. When is it? I think it's the first, April 1st, on child and adolescent mental health, and we'll go more in depth into that. But I did want to talk about, here the kind of relationship between anxiety and emotional regulation, right? We feel anxious, which causes us to it sets off like a chain reaction in our body, right? So we then are now emotionally dysregulated, and the anxiety really thinks it's doing something helpful. It really thinks it's keeping us safe, right? That fight or flight, freeze, fawn response. The anxiety really is like, I know what to do. Let's be anxious, right? And so we can kind of have an understanding that anxiety isn't really the enemy, right? It's like a function that our bodies have, that are trying something, and we are like, let's try something different, right? It's not that we hate you, anxiety. We appreciate that you're there for an important purpose. You do keep us safe, and right now, but you misfire a lot, right? You set the alarms off as if there's, with my work with little kids, like as if a tiger just ran into the room, but there is no tiger, right? But your body is now reacting in dysregulation as if there was a tiger, and that doesn't feel good, right? That really is an unpleasant feeling. Reflected in my practice too. I have a lot of older teens that still haven't gotten their license yet, which is different from my experience, which is like everybody got the second they turned 16, right? Yeah, I've seen that trend as well. Co-regulation does not mean pretending that you're always going to be calm and that you never get angry. It's about managing our own emotions to help our kids manage theirs, which is a really nice idea and much, much harder to apply in practice because we are all emotional beings, and it is really hard to stay regulated when our children are dysregulated. And so that's why the co-regulation is really so dependent on our own ability to take care of ourselves. And we talk about self-care, right? We're going beyond like getting your nails done or like whatever, right? We're talking about like really staying attuned to our own emotional needs and recognizing when like we're running on a deficit, our tank is empty, what do we need to do to fill our tank back up? Only we know that, right? And it might change from day to day. What I needed yesterday may not be the same thing as what I need today, but it's really, really hard to parent on an empty tank. And so taking breaks is really like so important. Or like if you're co-parenting in the same house, right? Like tagging in and out. Like I have to tag out. I need a break, right? So whatever it is that's going on, I need to just remove myself so that I can regulate myself. It's a little bit harder if you're single parenting. You don't have that tag in, tag out. So even more emphasis on self-care, right, when you're parenting, which means maybe sometimes you do have to make a hard decision of like, my kids want to go to Fun Inn, but I'm like already so overstimulated. Is really a Fun Inn trip what is going to be good for me? Or is that going to create a thing later where at bedtime I'm just like a mess, right? Sometimes we have to say, no, mommy just really needs a quiet day inside today. It's okay to say that, right? It's okay as a parent to be like, today is not the day we do all the things. Today is the day you guys have to maybe entertain yourselves while I like take some quiet time, right? That is, not only is it okay, like it's necessary for us to then be able to meet the needs of our kids when they're having a hard time. Validating our own feelings, right? Without shame. Anytime shame is present, what follows is just not going to be productive. Whatever, if we're shaming ourselves, the things that follow, our emotions and our choices are not going to be ones that lead to any growth or any positive change. Shame really is the killer of all growth, really is. We talked a little bit before about checking your story, right? What's the story I'm telling myself right now? Am I telling myself my child is doing this because they just like to make me mad? Or is the story, my child's having a hard time right now because they have an underdeveloped brain? I know it doesn't maybe sound like it'd make a big difference, but over time and kind of replacing one story with another, it really can make a difference in how we feel and what we do next. This is again some more co-regulation tips, right? So engage, don't enrage, use it or lose it, and move it or lose it, right? So these are kind of talking about like staying regulated yourself. This is talking about practicing right afterwards, right? Like, so what happened? What could we do differently? And this one is more about kind of keeping like that change of scenery, that physical, right? Like helping them switch gears. And so again, these all come from the whole brain child, and there's a lot more information in our packets if you're interested in it. Even if you don't want to read the book, there's some like listen to a podcast and they'll talk about it for 50 minutes and you kind of get the gist of what's going on. Sometimes I don't read the whole book. I don't have time to read the whole book. Dr. Becky Goodinside is fabulous. And then a lot of authors will, when they're promoting their book, go on lots of other people's podcasts and talk about the book. And I find those to be like really good. Like you're like, oh, I got the main points out of that. I was listening to it in my car, and now I don't have to read a book. Maybe I can read something that's maybe more pleasurable. Here's some more strategies. Again, not trying to talk to them when they're upset. Get them into a private place so that if they're not in front of other people, so they don't feel that shame or embarrassment. Get at or below their eye level. Identify and name the feelings, and then make space for the feelings. It's okay that you're upset. It's okay that you're angry. It's okay that you're frustrated. I get frustrated too. Punish less and praise more. This is an interesting one. Does that bring up anything for anybody when you hear that? Punish less, praise more. Yeah, I mean, it really is about learning your own kid, right? And you'll pick up, right, like what works and what doesn't work. It might be different between your two kids. One kid might respond really well to incentives, and other kids are like, I don't care about those incentives, right? Like, good.
They'll always come back and like apologize too.
Yeah.
That's the funny thing about it.
Yeah. Yes. It's not that they can't do it at all, right? It's like it's less developed than our own, but they are capable, right? Like even at every age, kids are capable, but they often need support. Another one I want to point out is like taking the long view, and that goes back to the story, which is like, it's not going to happen today maybe, but eventually they are going to gain that skill. So it's an investment, right? I'm investing in my kids' emotional development. And so I kind of have to zoom out. Sometimes we have to zoom out a little, right? When we're zoomed really close in, it can really feel frustrating, it can really feel discouraging. So we have to zoom out a little and even think about, well, like, where were they 6 months ago? Where were they 2 years ago? Well, they can get dressed now. That's a win. They're potty trained. That's a win, right? They pack their own backpack now. That's a win. So zooming out can sometimes also help give us that perspective, give us that encouragement that like this isn't just a never-ending bad day. Check if they're hungry. Are they hungry? Is that why they're flipping out? Right? I always forget. Are they tired? I always forget that one. I'm always like, how are you feeling? What's wrong? And then I'm like, I didn't ask them if they're just hungry. Do they need a snack? Did they eat their lunch? Hangry, yes. Hangry, are they hangry? Breathing is always helpful for us, for everybody. Everybody breathe. Breath is everything. Breath, we forget that breath is the most important thing that any of us do all day long, and it really can help us get back to regulation.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I give a tip. My kids refuse to take deep breaths. Like in the moment, I'm like this. It's like sometimes I'll like hold my water and but like they refuse to do it.
Yeah, there are actually some like tricks with balloons.
Yeah, we've done like candle blowing.
Yep, and candles. Yeah, it's hard. It doesn't come naturally to everybody, even though it's a thing we do all the time. A lot of us don't breathe the right way. Like, if you go to like a breathing, they'll be like, you're not even breathing from your diaphragm, right? You're like, oh, no wonder why like I don't feel great, because I'm not like oxygenizing like my whole system, right? Yeah, that's tricky. You might also have to like kind of hack it, like get them to do it without them knowing that they're doing it, right? I mentioned Dr. Becky. If you haven't heard of her, she's a clinical psychologist who specializes working with children, and I feel like she's very real. She has really honest conversations about her own experiences parenting. And for the sake of time, I'm going to leave these, you guys to kind of explore. These were from her Instagram, but they talk about like helping kids with anxiety to do dry runs, whether it's because they're nervous about like an upcoming thing at school or that doctor's appointment, to kind of role play out and be like, okay, let's imagine we're walking in to the doctor's office. How do you think you're going to feel? What do you think you're going to do, right? And another one is just like that. Using a mantra, right? Like I said, like I'm doing a hard thing and I'm doing my best. So if you guys want to check those out, I highly recommend her. We were going to do an activity. This is our first run, and so we're still working on the timing of everything, but I want to make sure Elena gets time to do things. So we were going to have you guys kind of talk about different scenarios, but we're going to skip that for now And I'm going to hand it over to Elena so she can talk about resiliency in our remaining time.
First things first, what do you guys think resilience is? So start there. What are we working with? What do we think about resilience? Being able to bounce back from adversity, from trauma, from tragedy, from stress. Realistically, as parents, you want to protect your kids. And life happens. We can't protect them from everything. And so how do we give them the skills to handle extreme stress, to handle tragedy, to handle stressful situations, right? These are all things that nobody can escape from, right? COVID-19, those are things that we couldn't escape from. It was a tragedy, something that we had to work through. So resiliency helps us navigate difficulties, navigate challenges. It improves mental health. A lot of studies have shown that children in early developmental stages have an easier time with resiliency than adults do, matter of fact. So we can learn from them.
Brain they have.
Yes.
Hard brains.
Yes.
Right?
And so sometimes, especially firefighters and like first responders have noticed that on scenes of traumatic events that kids are sometimes unfazed. And they think that's a trauma response. It's not always a trauma response. Sometimes it's just kids' strong resiliency. So our kids can handle a lot, sometimes more than we can, depending on the situation. So let's give them credit for that. Resiliency also gives us more empowerment, makes us feel empowered as the parents. You'll feel more empowered, and also knowing that you're empowering your children as well. It builds stronger relationships. It also reduces the risk of negative behaviors like substance abuse. Makes us more adaptable, and it helps us grow as people. So the 7 C's of resilience, this is just a helpful way to remember what we're working with when we talk about resilience. So how do we raise kids that are resilient? Competence, making sure that our kids feel like they are able to do the things in life, whether that's tying your shoes like you talked about before, whether that's putting toast in the toaster. Those are obviously very low-level, stressful situations. But do they also feel like they can manage conflict, giving them the competence to do those things? And confidence, these all work together. They're very fluid as far as resilience goes. Building connection, the connection you have with your kid also builds resiliency. Character, do they feel like they have a strong moral compass? Another thing to keep in mind about this, developmentally, kids don't have the capacity to tell right from wrong until the age 7. Okay, that's a rough number. You don't wake up when you're 7 years old and just automatically know right from wrong, right?
And if you're neurodiverse, that number
Exactly.
may be closer to 8 or 9.
Exactly. So when we talk about resilience, also knowing what are we working with, who are we working with, the underdeveloped brain, right? Contribution. Sometimes that's volunteering. Sometimes it's, can you help me set the table for dinner? Those things, making them feel like they're a part of the family, a part of the system, a part of the community, is going to also build that resiliency. Coping, we just talked about that. All the dysregulation, all learning how to co-regulate, and control. We can't always control the things outside of ourselves, but giving the kids the ability to know, I can't control the situation, but I can control myself, what's going on inside of me, that internal locus of control. So these things are going to be really important moving forward with resilience. And these things are also nuanced. Not every day is going to look the same, even for me, even for adults, right? Some days, we talked about the hall, sometimes we don't have that connection. Sometimes we're lonely. Sometimes we're hungry. Sometimes we feel like we're doing everything wrong. We are still resilient, even though we feel like we're doing everything wrong. First and foremost, parent self-care and modeling. We can't be resilient if we're not taking care of ourselves. So Jen talked a little bit before about what parent self-care looks like. And something to keep in mind when we talk about modeling too is, I think Jen, you mentioned like apologizing to our kids. Like when we yell, like I yelled at you, I didn't mean to yell at you, I'm sorry for that. It also means if, we are transparent with them. We admit when we do things wrong, and also, we can also praise ourselves when we do things right. Like, I just made dinner. Isn't it good? Don't you like that? I did good. Like, the children will see how we talk to ourselves, how we treat ourselves. And how we treat ourselves is also their barometer of how they're allowed to treat themselves. Ooh, that's scary. I just got tingles thinking about that. Do we always treat ourselves like we want our kids to treat themselves? That's going to be a big one moving forward. And most of the time, children respect that. Teenagers respect that. And specifying the praise as well. So there's going to be a Kahoot. I don't know if we'll have time to do the Kahoot little game, but when we talk about specifying the praise, like saying good job, that's great. Saying I'm proud of you, that's great too. But does that build resiliency? Building resiliency would be saying something like, you shared your toys, you are so kind. Saying exactly what they did that was kind, and then saying what message that sends other people, right? I saw you doing this, that told me that you're really kind. It told me that you're really caring, that you love your sister, you know? And then it's kind of cool because I visited my niece and nephew 2 months ago, and I said, my nephew, who's 3, shoveled my driveway for me, which was so sweet. He had a cute little shovel. And I said, that was really great. I really appreciate you shoveling for me. You're such a hard worker. And he ran to his dad, and he said, Dad, Auntie Elena said I'm a hard worker. And they hear those things, and it matters to them. But what he didn't hear was good job, right? Which is great. We want to know that we're doing well. I want to know that I'm doing well. We all want to know that we're doing well. But what is it that we're doing well? And we've talked about before, making mistakes. Do they feel safe making mistakes? What does that look like? You want to click to the next one. These are just some more ways to build resiliency. Supporting children through adversity, not avoiding the adversity. So for instance, dad lost his job. How do you have that conversation? That's challenging. Do we avoid it altogether, or do we have the conversation? This also, how we have the conversation depends on how old the kids are, as we're all aware probably, right? So what does that look like? How do you talk to your kids about that? They're going to notice if dad's home all of a sudden, right? So not avoiding the adversity. Setting boundaries and sticking to rules. Are the expectations in the home clear? Kids like safety. They don't always think they like safety, right? Because they want to run into the middle of the road, they want to play, they want to have fun. But they do want to be safe, and they can't have fun unless they feel safe, right? When we work with traumatized kids, a lot of kids who are 5 years old who have been through extreme trauma, they don't know how to have fun because they've never felt safe. The fact that you guys are here tells me that your kids probably feel safe because you care enough to come and to learn, and that's awesome. Specifying the praise, right? We're specifying the praise here. The 4 S's, do they feel safe? Do they feel seen, soothed, secure? And then teaching mind-sight skills. This is another one that in the PDF books that we have, they mention mind-sight a lot, and that's basically empathy in a lot of ways, being able to tell, okay, are they sad? Are they mad? Are they angry? And this also differs with neurodiversity, right? Because sometimes with autism, you can't tell if someone's mad at you, you can't tell if someone's sad. So take that with a grain of salt and, see what your kids are actually able to do as far as mindset.
So thank you guys so much for an engaging conversation.
Thank you very much.
And I hope to see some of you guys back at our other series. We have next week is child development, and then we have adolescent mental health and substance use, and then we have neurodiversity, parenting neurodiverse kids for the next 3 weeks. So I hope to see some of you guys back.
We also
Share it with your friends.
We also have an exit survey we'd love for you guys to give us feedback on the things that you liked about the class, things you didn't like, things that we can do better to provide information. We love the feedback. We'd love to hear it.
That helps improve us, because you guys were our pilot. So this will be a reoccurring series, but this was our first run. And does everyone know about QR code? You take a picture of it, and then it opens up the link? Okay, I don't know. I only just learned how to use it 6 months ago. So.
Ask your 7-year-old, they'll know.
Yeah. Everyone has a really good night.
Thank you, guys.